The clock on the kitchen wall showed 11:30 p.m. when Roberto finally turned off the last burner in his small restaurant. He had been working since 6 in the morning, and his back ached from spending hours hunched over the prep counter. The restaurant, which he called Corazon Kitchen, had been his life for the past 8 years, but lately, it felt more like a burden than a dream. Roberto wiped down the counter one last time and looked around the empty dining room. Only 12 customers had come in that day. 12. He remembered when this place used to be packed every night when families would wait outside for a table. But things had changed. The big chain restaurants down the street offered cheaper meals, and people seemed to prefer drive-thrus over sitting down for a real meal. He pulled out his phone and checked his bank account, something he had been doing every night for the past 3 months. The numbers stared back at him, cold and unforgiving. After paying his suppliers and the rent, he barely had enough left to buy groceries for himself. His landlord had already called twice this week about next month's rent. Roberto's grandmother used to say that everything happened for a reason, but standing alone in his struggling restaurant at nearly midnight, he found it hard to believe her words. She had been the one who taught him to cook, who filled his childhood with the smell of fresh tortillas and the sound of her singing while she stirred her famous mole sauce. This restaurant was supposed to honor her memory, but now it felt like he was failing her all over again. He grabbed his keys from behind the register and walked toward the front door. The December air hit him like a slap when he stepped outside. Phoenix was supposed to be warm, but winter nights could still bite through your jacket and make you wish you were somewhere else. Roberto pulled his collar up and turned to lock the door when he heard something that made him stop. It was quiet crying, the kind that someone tries to hide but can't quite manage. He looked around the empty street, and there, sitting against the wall next to his restaurant's side door, were 2 figures huddled together under a thin blanket. Roberto's first thought was to keep walking. He had his own problems, and getting involved with strangers on the street never ended well. His practical side told him to go home, heat up some leftovers, and pretend he hadn't seen anything. But something about the scene stopped him cold. The older person was a woman, maybe in her 70s, with gray hair tied back in a simple ponytail. She was holding a young boy who couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old. The boy was fast asleep, his small body curled against her for warmth, clutching what looked like a stuffed dog that had seen better days. Roberto stood there for a moment, watching them. The woman noticed him and quickly wiped her eyes as if being caught crying was somehow shameful. She whispered something to the sleeping boy and gently shifted him so she could stand up. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice carrying a slight accent that reminded Roberto of his own grandmother. "We're not trying to cause trouble. We'll move along." Something in her voice, in the way she apologized for simply existing, broke something inside Roberto's chest. He found himself walking toward them instead of away. "Wait," he said, holding up his hand. "You don't have to go anywhere." The woman looked at him suspiciously, and Roberto couldn't blame her. A stranger approaching you on the street at midnight rarely meant anything good. But she didn't wake the boy or try to run. She just stood there protecting him with her body while she sized up this new threat. "Are you okay?" Roberto asked, immediately feeling stupid. Of course they weren't okay. People who were okay didn't sleep on sidewalks in December. The woman's shoulders sagged a little, and for a moment, Roberto thought she might start crying again. Instead, she straightened up and looked him in the eye. "We're fine," she said, but her voice cracked on the last word. Roberto looked at the boy, still sleeping peacefully despite the cold and the hard concrete. His clothes were clean but worn, and his shoes had holes that someone had tried to patch with duct tape. The stuffed dog he was holding was missing one eye, but it was obvious that it was loved. "What's your name?" Roberto asked the woman. She hesitated for a moment, as if giving her name might somehow make things worse. "I'm Elena," she finally said, "and this is my grandson Diego." Roberto nodded and introduced himself. Then he asked the question he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer to. "How long have you been out here?" Elena's face crumpled for just a second before she pulled herself together. "Since this morning," she whispered. "We got evicted. My disability check was supposed to come last week, but there was some kind of problem with the computer system. The landlord said he couldn't wait anymore." Roberto felt his heart sink. He knew exactly how that story went. One missed payment, one computer glitch, one bureaucratic mistake, and suddenly your whole life could fall apart. The difference between having a roof over your head and sleeping on the street was often just a few $100s. and some bad timing. The shelters are all full, Elena continued, her voice getting stronger as she talked. We've been walking around all day trying to find somewhere safe to sleep. I saw your restaurant sign and thought maybe we could just sit here for a while. The light above your door makes it feel safer. Roberto looked up at the old neon sign that spelled out Corazon Kitchen. Half the letters flickered, and the whole thing probably needed to be replaced, but it had been his grandmother's favorite part of the restaurant. She always said that light would guide hungry people to good food and warm hearts. Standing there in the cold, looking at Elena and Diego, Roberto realized his grandmother had been right again. Have you eaten today? He asked. Elena shook her head. We had some crackers this morning, but I wanted to save what little money we have for Diego. That decided it. Roberto pulled out his keys and walked toward the restaurant door. Elena watched him nervously, probably wondering if he was going to call the police or tell them to move along. Instead, Roberto unlocked the door and held it open. Come inside, he said. It's too cold out here and I've got some leftover soup that needs eating. Elena stared at him like he had just offered her $1 million. We can't, she said. We don't have money to pay for food. Roberto smiled, the first real smile he had managed all day. Did I ask for money? Elena looked down at sleeping Diego, then back at Roberto. He could see her trying to decide if this was real or if it was too good to be true. Finally, she gently shook her grandson awake. Diego, mijo, she whispered, wake up. This nice man is going to let us get warm inside. The boy opened his eyes slowly, confused and disoriented. When he saw Roberto standing there, he instinctively moved closer to his grandmother. It's okay, Elena told him softly. He's going to help us. Roberto held the door open wider and gestured for them to come in. As they walked past him into the warm restaurant, he caught the scent of Elena's perfume, something floral and faint that reminded him so much of his grandmother that his eyes started to water. He had no idea that this simple act of kindness was about to change all three of their lives forever. The warmth of the restaurant wrapped around Elena and Diego like a gentle hug. Roberto watched as the boy's eyes grew wide, taking in the colorful walls decorated with painted tiles and family photos. The smell of spices still lingered in the air from the day's cooking, and Roberto noticed how Elena breathed it in deeply, as if she was remembering something precious. Sit anywhere you like, Roberto said, gesturing toward the tables. Elena chose one near the kitchen, probably so she could keep an eye on everything around them. Diego climbed into the chair next to her, still clutching his one-eyed stuffed dog. Roberto disappeared into the kitchen and returned a few minutes later with 2 steaming bowls of pozole, the hominy soup his grandmother had taught him to make. The rich red broth was topped with fresh cabbage, radishes, and a sprinkle of oregano. He also brought out a basket of warm tortillas and 2 glasses of horchata. Elena stared at the food in front of her, and Roberto saw tears forming in her eyes again. This is too much, she whispered. We can't accept all this. My grandmother always said that food tastes better when it's shared, Roberto replied, settling into the chair across from them. Besides, this soup has been sitting in my kitchen all day. You're doing me a favor by eating it. Diego looked up at his grandmother, waiting for permission. When she nodded, he picked up his spoon and took a careful sip. His face lit up immediately. Abuela, it tastes like the soup you make, he said excitedly. Elena smiled and tasted the pozole herself. Roberto watched as her expression changed from polite gratitude to genuine surprise. This is incredible, she said. You use guajillo chilies, don't you? And a touch of chocolate in the broth. Roberto nodded, impressed. Not many people can taste the chocolate. My grandmother's secret ingredient. My grandmother taught me the same trick, Elena said softly. She said chocolate makes everything better, even when life is bitter. As they ate, Roberto found himself really talking to someone for the first time in months. Elena told him about her life, and each detail hit closer to home than the last. She had worked as a cook in various restaurants for 40 years, starting when she was just 16 years old. Her hands, now twisted with arthritis, had prepared thousands of meals for families throughout the city. I could make any. Diego had finished his soup and was now drawing on a napkin with a broken crayon he pulled from his pocket. Roberto glanced at the drawing and saw a simple house with 3 stick figures standing in front of it. A woman, a man, and a small boy, all holding hands. Diego is very talented, Roberto said. What grade are you in, buddy? 4th grade, Diego answered without looking up from his drawing. But I haven't been to school in 3 days because we don't have a permanent address right now. Elena's face tightened with worry. The school says they need proof of where we live before he can come back. I've been trying to figure out how to handle the paperwork, but everything is so complicated when you don't have a home. Roberto felt his chest tighten. He remembered being Diego's age and how important school had felt, how it was the one place where the world made sense even when everything else was falling apart. The thought of this bright kid missing out on education because of paperwork made him angry. "Tell me about your parents," Roberto said gently to Diego. The boy's crayon stopped moving. Elena reached over and put her hand on his shoulder. "They died in a car accident 2 years ago," Elena explained quietly. "Diego came to live with me after that. His parents were good kids. They worked hard, saved money, had plans. But sometimes life doesn't care about your plans." Roberto nodded, understanding more than he wanted to. His own parents had died when he was 12, leaving him to be raised by his grandmother. The similarity wasn't lost on him. "I tried to keep everything together after they passed," Elena continued, "but it's hard to raise a growing boy on disability payments. The rent kept going up, but my income stayed the same. I picked up some cleaning jobs when I could, but my arthritis makes it difficult to work long hours." "What happened with your disability check?" Roberto asked. Elena sighed deeply. "Some computer error at the government office. They said it might take 2 weeks to fix, maybe more. 2 weeks doesn't sound like much until you realize you need that money to survive. I called every day, but they kept telling me to be patient." Roberto had dealt with enough bureaucracy while running his restaurant to know how these things went. Computer errors, lost paperwork, systems that didn't talk to each other. It was like the whole system was designed to frustrate people who needed help the most. "Where were you living before?" he asked. "A little apartment about 10 miles from here," Elena said. "Nothing fancy, but it was home. Diego had his own room, and there was a small kitchen where I could cook his favorite meals. The landlord seemed nice at first, but when the rent was 3 days late, everything changed." Diego looked up from his drawing. "I had to leave my fish behind," he said sadly. "His name was Nemo, and I couldn't carry his tank." Roberto felt something break inside his chest. "I'm sorry about your fish, Diego." The boy shrugged, trying to be brave. "Abuela says maybe someone else will take care of him now." Elena stood up and started collecting the empty bowls, but Roberto stopped her. "Leave those," he said. "You're guest here. Please," Elena said. "Let me help. I've been taking charity all day and it doesn't feel right. I need to do something useful." Roberto understood that feeling. Pride was sometimes the only thing people had left when everything else was gone. He nodded and let her carry the dishes to the kitchen. What happened next surprised him. Elena moved around his kitchen like she belonged there. She knew exactly where to find the soap and sponges without asking. She washed each bowl carefully, the way someone does when they respect good dishes. More importantly, she started organizing things that Roberto hadn't even realized were messy. "Your spice rack could use some attention," she said, not in a critical way, but like someone who cared about the kitchen she was working in. "And those onions should be stored somewhere darker if you want them to last longer." Roberto watched her work and realized something that shocked him. Elena wasn't just helping with dishes. She was improving his kitchen. Her 40 years of professional cooking experience showed in every small adjustment she made. "You really know what you're doing," he said. Elena smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked genuinely happy. "This feels like home," she admitted. "I've missed being in a real kitchen, cooking for people who appreciate good food." Diego had fallen asleep at the table, his head resting on his drawing. Roberto looked at the boy, then at Elena organizing his spice rack, and felt something he hadn't experienced in months. The restaurant didn't feel empty anymore. "Elena," Roberto said quietly, "what if I told you that you and Diego could stay here tonight? I have a small office in the back with a couch. It's not much, but it's warm and safe." Elena stopped organizing spices and turned to look at him. "Why would you do that for strangers?" Roberto thought about his grandmother, about all the times she had helped people without expecting anything in return. Because sometimes the right thing to do is also the simple thing to do. Elena wiped her hands on a dish towel and looked at sleeping Diego. "Just for tonight," she said softly. "And tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." Roberto nodded, but deep down, he was already hoping that tomorrow would bring more questions than answers. Roberto woke up the next morning to the sound of something he hadn't heard in his restaurant for years. Humming. He rubbed his eyes and checked his phone. It was 6:30 a.m., 30 minutes before he usually arrived at work. The humming was coming from his kitchen, along with smells that made his stomach growl immediately. He had given Elena and Diego his office for the night, setting up blankets and pillows on the old couch he kept back there. When he left them at midnight, Diego was already fast asleep, and Elena was tucking him in like they were in the finest hotel in the world. Now, walking toward his kitchen, Roberto wondered if he had made a huge mistake. What did he really know about these people? What if they had stolen something or damaged his equipment? His practical side had been arguing with his heart all night long, but when he pushed through the kitchen doors, his worries disappeared instantly. Elena stood at his stove, cooking eggs in a way that made them look like golden clouds. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, and she had somehow made his small kitchen look cleaner and more organized than it had in months. "Good morning," Elena said without turning around. "I hope you don't mind. I wanted to make breakfast to thank you for your kindness." Roberto looked around his kitchen in amazement. Everything was spotless, but more than that, everything seemed to be in exactly the right place. His spices were arranged by color and frequency of use. His knives were properly sharpened and organized. Even his old pots and pans seemed to shine brighter than usual. "How did you do all this?" he asked. Elena smiled and handed him a cup of coffee that tasted better than anything he had ever made in his own restaurant. "I've been awake since 5. Old habits die hard, I suppose. Plus, I couldn't sleep knowing how much you've helped us." Diego emerged from the office, his hair sticking up in every direction, still clutching his one-eyed stuffed dog. "Good morning, Mr. Roberto," he said politely. "Abuela made eggs that taste like sunshine." Roberto couldn't help but laugh. "Eggs that taste like sunshine?" "That's what my mama used to say about Abuela's cooking," Diego explained, climbing onto a stool at the prep counter. "She said Abuela could make anything taste like sunshine, even on rainy days." Elena placed a plate in front of Roberto, and he took a bite of the eggs. Diego wasn't exaggerating. Somehow Elena had taken ordinary ingredients from his kitchen and turned them into something magical. The eggs were perfectly fluffy, seasoned with something that tasted familiar but special at the same time. "What did you put in these?" Roberto asked. "A little bit of cumin, some fresh herbs, and a secret ingredient my grandmother taught me," Elena said with a wink. "Love always makes food taste better." Roberto was about to respond when his phone rang. It was his supplier, calling about a late payment for last week's food delivery. Roberto stepped outside to take the call, feeling his good mood deflate as he negotiated another extension on his bill. When he came back inside, Elena was watching him with concern. "Everything okay?" Roberto forced a smile. "Just business stuff. Nothing to worry about." But Elena had lived long enough to recognize the look of someone dealing with money problems. "You're struggling, aren't you?" she said gently. "The restaurant isn't doing well." Roberto didn't know why, but something about Elena's kind eyes made him want to tell the truth. "I'm barely keeping the doors open," he admitted. "Customers don't come like they used to. I keep telling myself things will get better, but I'm not sure how much longer I can hold on." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "You know what your problem is?" Roberto raised his eyebrows. "Please tell me." "Your food is good, but it's not special," Elena said, not in a mean way, but like a grandmother giving advice. "People can get good food anywhere. They come to a place like this for something they can't get at home." "And what's that?" Roberto asked. "Heart," Elena said simply. "Your grandmother's recipes had heart. I can taste it in that pozole you made last night. But the rest of your menu feels like you're just going through the motions." Roberto felt a little defensive, but he also knew Elena was right. Since his grandmother died, he had been cooking with his head instead of his heart, focusing on what was cheap and easy instead of what was meaningful. "I have an idea," Elena said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What if I helped you for a few days? Just until we figure out our housing situation. I could teach you some recipes that might bring customers back." Roberto stared at her. "You want to work here?" "I want to cook again," Elena said, and Roberto could hear the longing in her voice. "My hands hurt, but they still remember how to make magic happen in the kitchen. And you need help. Maybe we can help each other." Diego looked up from his breakfast. "Abuela makes the best mole in the whole world. People used to drive from other cities just to taste it." Roberto thought about his bank account, about the bills piling up on his desk, about the empty tables that should be full of happy customers. Then he looked at Elena, who was watching him hopefully and made another decision that surprised him. "Okay," he said. "Let's try it." Elena's face lit up like Diego's had when he tasted the pozole the night before. "Really?" "Really," Roberto said. "But I can't pay you much right now." "You're giving us a place to stay and a chance to be useful," Elena said. "That's worth more than money right now." The first thing Elena did was completely reorganize Roberto's menu. She took out a notebook that was held together with rubber bands and started writing down recipes in careful handwriting. Each recipe came with a story about where it came from and why it was special. "This mole recipe belonged to my great-great-grandmother," she explained, showing Roberto a page covered in faded ink. "She created it for her wedding day, and every woman in my family has made it since then. It takes 2 days to prepare properly, but people will remember it for the rest of their lives." Roberto watched Elena work and realized he was seeing something he had never witnessed before. A true master at work. She moved around the kitchen like she was dancing, her arthritic hands somehow becoming graceful when they were creating something beautiful. Diego set up his homework at a table near the kitchen, where he could watch his grandmother work while he practiced his math problems. Roberto found himself helping the boy with fractions while Elena prepared a test batch of her famous mole sauce. "You're good at teaching," Elena observed, watching Roberto explain multiplication to Diego. "Have you ever thought about having children?" Roberto felt a familiar ache in his chest. "I always thought I would someday, but running this place doesn't leave much time for relationships." "Family isn't always about blood," Elena said wisely. "Sometimes the people you're meant to care for just walk into your life when you need them most." By lunchtime, the smell of Elena's cooking had filled the entire restaurant. When Roberto's first customer of the day walked in, Mrs. Chen, who came in every Tuesday for his chicken soup, she stopped in the doorway and took a deep breath. "Something smells incredible in here," she said. "What's that amazing smell?" Roberto looked at Elena, who nodded encouragingly. "We're testing some new recipes," he said. "Would you like to try a sample of our mole sauce?" Mrs. Chen tasted a small spoonful and her eyes grew wide. "This is extraordinary," she said. "I've never tasted anything like it." "When will this be on your regular menu?" "Starting tomorrow," Roberto said, making the decision on the spot. Mrs. Chen ordered 2 full portions to take home to her family. As Roberto watched her leave with a smile on her face, he realized that Elena had been right. His restaurant hadn't just been missing customers, it had been missing soul. And somehow, in the span of one morning, Elena and Diego had brought that soul back to life. The kitchen didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like home. 3 months after Elena and Diego first walked into his restaurant, Roberto couldn't believe how much his life had changed. The dining room that used to echo with emptiness now buzzed with conversation every night. People lined up outside on weekends, waiting for a table to try Elena's legendary mole or her perfectly seasoned pozole. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. For the first few weeks, Roberto watched nervously as Elena slowly introduced her recipes one by one. Each dish told a story, and Elena made sure every customer knew exactly what they were eating and why it was special. She would emerge from the kitchen to explain how her great-grandmother had created a particular sauce, or how her mother had modified a recipe during hard times to make it stretch further. Customers fell in love not just with the food, but with Elena herself. She had a way of making everyone feel like family, like they were eating in her own home instead of a restaurant. Diego became the unofficial mascot, doing his homework at table 6 every afternoon, while customers helped him with math problems and reading assignments. The money problems that had kept Roberto awake at night started to disappear. For the first time in 2 years, he was able to pay all his bills on time. He even hired 2 part-time servers to help with the dinner rush, something he never thought he'd be able to afford again. But success brought new challenges that Roberto hadn't expected. The biggest problem was that Elena and Diego were still living in his office. What had started as a one-night emergency arrangement had stretched into 3 months, and Roberto knew it wasn't fair to either of them. Diego needed his own room and a stable place to call home. Elena deserved privacy and dignity, not a makeshift bed in the back of a restaurant. Roberto had been looking for apartments they could afford, but every time he found something suitable, the application process revealed another obstacle. Most landlords wanted employment history, references, and credit checks that Elena couldn't provide. Being homeless for even a short time had created a paper trail that made getting housed again incredibly difficult. Then there was the bigger issue that Elena had finally trusted Roberto enough to share with him. She had been living in the country without proper documentation for 30 years. She had come as a young woman to work and send money back to her family in Mexico, always planning to return home someday. But life had happened. She fell in love, got married, had children, and put down roots. When her husband died 15 years ago, Elena had stayed to be close to her daughter and Diego. "I've been invisible for so long," Elena told Roberto one evening after the restaurant closed. "I pay taxes, I follow all the laws, I contribute to my community, but on paper I don't exist. That makes everything complicated." Roberto learned just how complicated when a local food blogger wrote a glowing review of the restaurant that mentioned Elena by name. The review went viral on social media, bringing in customers from all over the city. People started calling to make reservations specifically to meet the grandmother with magic hands who makes mole like angels. The attention was wonderful for business, but it also made Elena nervous. She started looking over her shoulder when she walked to the grocery store. She worried about what would happen if the wrong people saw the article and started asking questions about her legal status. Roberto's own success created another unexpected problem. The restaurant that had been struggling to survive was now so popular that he couldn't handle all the customers who wanted to eat there. People waited 2 hours for tables, and Roberto had to turn away walk-ins every night. He knew he was losing money by not being able to serve everyone who wanted to eat Elena's food. A solution appeared in the form of David Chen, Mrs. Chen's son, who happened to own 3 restaurants in nearby cities. David had been coming to Roberto's restaurant twice a week since trying his mother's take-home mole, and he had a business proposition that could change everything. "I want to help you expand," David told Roberto over coffee one morning. "Your food is incredible, and Elena's recipes could make both of us very successful. I'm talking about opening 3 more locations, maybe more if things go well." Roberto felt his heart race. It was the kind of opportunity he had dreamed about for years. But when he looked over at Elena, who was teaching Diego how to properly season rice at the prep counter, he felt worried instead of excited. What would that mean for Elena? Roberto asked carefully. David's expression grew serious. That's the complicated part. To expand properly, everything would need to be official. Elena would need to be on payroll, with proper documentation and work permits. I can't have any legal issues with my business partners. That night, Roberto couldn't sleep. The expansion opportunity was incredible, but it would mean risking Elena's safety. He had spent the last 3 months watching her transform his failing restaurant into something special. And more importantly, he had watched her become like a mother to him. The thought of putting her in danger made him sick to his stomach. Elena must have sensed his worry, because she knocked on his apartment door the next morning before the restaurant opened. "You're thinking too hard about something," she said, settling into his kitchen chair like she belonged there. "What's troubling you?" Roberto told her about David's offer and his concerns about her legal status. Elena listened quietly, occasionally nodding, her hands folded in her lap. "This is a wonderful opportunity for you," she said when he finished. "Not if it puts you at risk," Roberto replied. "I won't do anything that could hurt you or Diego." Elena smiled sadly. "Roberto, you've already done more for us than anyone had a right to expect. You saved us when we had nowhere to go. You gave us purpose when we felt useless. You made us feel like family when we thought we were all alone in the world. You saved me too," Roberto said quietly. "This restaurant was dying before you walked into it. I was dying before you walked into it." Elena reached across the table and took his hand in her arthritis-twisted fingers. "Then we saved each other, but that doesn't mean you should give up your dreams to protect us. What if we could find a way to make it work?" Roberto asked. "What if there was a legal path for you?" Elena had been thinking about the same thing. "I've been researching immigration lawyers, but good ones are expensive. And even if I found someone who could help, the process takes years." Roberto made a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. What if money wasn't an issue? What if we hired the best lawyer we could find? "Roberto, you can't afford that." "Maybe I can't," Roberto said. "But maybe David's expansion deal could." Elena stared at him. "You would use your business success to help with my legal problems?" "Family helps family," Roberto said, using Elena's own words from a conversation they'd had weeks ago. "You taught me that." The next challenge came from an unexpected source. Diego's school had been asking questions about his living situation, and a social worker was scheduled to visit the restaurant the following week. Someone had reported that a child was living in a commercial building, which could trigger an investigation that none of them were prepared for. "What are we going to do?" Elena asked, her voice shaking for the first time since Roberto had known her. Roberto looked around his restaurant, filled with the smell of Elena's cooking and the sound of Diego's laughter as he helped clear tables. This place had become more than a business. It had become a home for all of them. "We're going to figure it out," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes, we're going to figure it out together." But as Roberto watched Elena worry about Diego's future and their precarious living situation, he realized that good intentions and determination might not be enough to solve the complex problems they were facing. Sometimes love and hard work needed help from luck, timing, and people who understood that families don't always look the way you expect them to. The social worker arrived on a busy Thursday afternoon when the restaurant was packed with lunch customers. Roberto watched nervously as Ms. Rodriguez walked through the dining room, taking notes on her clipboard and observing everything around her. Elena stayed in the kitchen, hands shaking as she stirred a pot of beans, while Diego sat at his usual table pretending to focus on his homework. Ms. Rodriguez was younger than Roberto had expected, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that put him slightly at ease. She introduced herself and explained that someone had reported a child living in a commercial building, which required an official investigation. "I need to see where Diego has been staying," she said professionally but not unkindly. Roberto led her to the office, his heart pounding. The small space looked even tinier with an official visitor examining it. The couch where Diego slept, the makeshift privacy curtain Elena had hung up, the neat stack of their few belongings in the corner. It all looked so inadequate when seen through the eyes of someone whose job was to protect children. "This isn't a suitable living arrangement for a child," Ms. Rodriguez said, writing more notes. "Diego needs a proper bedroom, space to play, and a stable home environment." Roberto felt his world starting to collapse. "I know it's not perfect, but they have nowhere else to go. Elena is working to save money for an apartment, but finding a place that will accept them has been incredibly difficult." Ms. Rodriguez looked at him with sympathy. "I can see that you care about this family, Mr. Roberto, but my job is to ensure Diego's welfare. Unless this situation changes soon, I'll have to consider other options for his placement." The threat hung in the air like a dark cloud. Roberto knew exactly what other options meant: foster care, separation from Elena, the destruction of the only family Diego had left. That evening, after the restaurant closed, Roberto sat with Elena and Diego at their favorite table. They had been talking in circles for hours, trying to find solutions that seemed impossible. "Maybe I should take Diego back to Mexico," Elena said quietly. "At least there we wouldn't have to worry about paperwork and investigations." "No," Diego said firmly, surprising both adults with his intensity. "This is our home now. Mr. Roberto is our family. I don't want to leave." Roberto looked at this brave little boy who had lost his parents, been homeless, and now faced losing his grandmother too, yet still fought for what he believed was right. In that moment, Roberto made a decision that would change all their lives. "What if I adopted Diego?" Roberto said suddenly. Elena stared at him in shock. "What?" "I mean, what if we became a real family, legally? I could adopt Diego and you could be his legal guardian while living with us. I've been thinking about buying a house anyway, somewhere with enough space for all of us." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "Roberto, you can't be serious. You barely know us." "I know enough," Roberto said firmly. "I know that you've made my restaurant successful. I know that Diego is the smartest, kindest kid I've ever met. I know that you both have made my life better in every possible way. And I know that families don't always start the traditional way." Diego jumped up from his chair and hugged Roberto tightly. "Does this mean you'd really be my dad?" Roberto felt tears threatening his own eyes. "If that's what you want, buddy, yes," Diego said without hesitation. "I want that more than anything." Elena wiped her eyes with her napkin. "But what about my legal status? What about the expansion deal with David? You can't risk everything for us." Roberto had been thinking about this too. "I talked to David again yesterday. He's willing to work with us on both problems. He knows an immigration lawyer who specializes in cases like yours, and he's agreed to structure the expansion deal so that part of the profits go directly toward your legal fees." "Why would he do that?" Elena asked. Because he's eaten your mole, Roberto said with a smile, and because good business partners take care of each other. The next few months became a whirlwind of paperwork, legal meetings, and bureaucratic processes that tested everyone's patience. The immigration lawyer that David recommended, Maria Santos, turned out to be exactly what Elena needed, someone who understood both the legal complexities and the human side of immigration issues. Your case is actually stronger than you think, Maria told Elena during their first meeting. You've been in the community for 30 years. You have no criminal record, you're supporting your orphaned grandson, and you're now a key employee in a growing business. These factors work in your favor. Meanwhile, Roberto started the adoption process for Diego. The social worker, Ms. Rodriguez, was initially skeptical about the arrangement, but as she watched Roberto, Elena, and Diego together, she began to see what Roberto had realized months ago. This was already a family in every way that mattered. I've never seen an adoption case quite like this, Ms. Rodriguez admitted during one of her visits. But Diego is clearly thriving, and the love between all three of you is obvious. Sometimes families form in unexpected ways. The restaurant expansion moved forward at the same time. David proved to be the perfect business partner, understanding that Roberto's success was tied directly to Elena's recipes and expertise. They opened the first new location 6 months later, with Elena training the head chef personally and Roberto overseeing operations. The breakthrough in Elena's immigration case came almost exactly 1 year after she and Diego had first appeared outside Roberto's restaurant. Maria called with news that Elena's application for permanent residency had been approved. It's official, Maria said. Elena is now legally authorized to live and work in the United States, and in 5 years she can apply for citizenship if she wants to. Roberto had never seen Elena cry tears of joy before, but that's exactly what happened when he told her the news. She had spent 30 years living in fear, afraid that one wrong move could tear her away from her family and the life she had built. Now, for the first time since she was a young woman, she was truly free. Diego's adoption was finalized 2 months later in a courtroom filled with friends from the restaurant. Mrs. Chen brought flowers, David brought a photographer, and half their regular customers showed up to witness the moment when Roberto officially became Diego's father. Family isn't always about blood, Roberto told the judge, repeating Elena's words from months before. Sometimes the people you're meant to love just walk into your life when you need them most. Today, 3 years later, Roberto, Elena, and Diego live in a house with a big kitchen where Elena can cook to her heart's content, and a backyard where Diego plays with the dog they adopted from the local shelter. The restaurant chain has grown to 8 locations across 3 states, each one serving Elena's traditional recipes alongside Roberto's own creations. Diego, now 12, helps in the original restaurant every afternoon after school, just like he always has. He's learning to cook from both Roberto and Elena, and he's already talking about taking over the family business someday. Elena often tells people that Roberto saved them that cold December night. But Roberto knows the truth. They saved each other. What started as one act of kindness on a cold night became something none of them could have imagined. A family, a thriving business, and a community of people who understand that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from the most unexpected places. And every night, when Roberto locks up the restaurant and heads home to his family, he thinks about his grandmother's words, "Everything happens for a reason." Looking at his life now, surrounded by love and success that grew from a moment of simple human kindness, he finally understands what she meant.